Aboriginal people make up just 2.5% of Australia's population, yet they account for 26% of the country's prison inmates. Governments have long pledged to turn that around, yet it's now more than 2 decades since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody urged that prisons be a last resort. As Bronwyn Herbert explains, another report released today calls for investment in drug and alcohol rehabilitation as an alternative to prison.
Yes. Morning, sis. How you going?
Hey, good. How are you?
Not too bad.
Got some guys looking forward to seeing you in here today.
Actor Dean Daly-Jones is a regular visitor at Casuarina Prison, one of Perth's largest jails.
We've had a lot of positive results with this package that we put together.
Here, 278 Indigenous men are behind bars. That's almost half the number of total prisoners. Daly-Jones, who is best known for his role in the movie Mad Bastards, grew up with prisons a constant in his life.
My first Christmas that I remember was in Fremantle Prison with my mother and one of my sisters, and I just saw lots of Aboriginal men. Everyone going, "Oh, yeah, what's going on?" I didn't really digest that or understand that until later.
In his 20s, he too became a statistic. Fueled by alcohol, he was repeatedly locked up for assault.
My mother wrote a letter to me once when I was locked up for the weekend in Fremantle Watch House, and she gave it to the sergeant, and the sergeant gave me this letter, and I read this letter, and she had some key points in it. She said, "I didn't bring you into this world to see you, end up like this."
The statistics are shocking and extraordinary. Despite Aboriginal people making up just 2.5% of Australia's population, 1/3 of all female prisoners are Aboriginal and 1/4 of all male prisoners are Indigenous. On average, more than 1,000 teenagers are locked up in juvenile detention centres every night, and over half of those are Aboriginal boys, the majority committing crimes while intoxicated. That creates a pressure cooker environment. Just 2 weeks ago, inmates destroyed a juvenile detention centre in Perth. The teenage detainees are now locked up in an adult prison while the centre is being repaired.
Certainly people who induced that to occur, if there were leaders amongst them, should be reprimanded in an appropriate way. But if you're talking about 74 kids, I know that not all of those 74 kids would have wanted to do what happened. I know that some of those 74 kids would have been caught up on the coattails of others.
Indigenous leader Ted Wilkes is furious that little has changed over the decades.
Prisons as a last resort was promised to us in 1991 with the Royal Commission to Aboriginal deaths in custody. Hasn't happened.
The National Indigenous Drug and Alcohol Council commissioned accounting firm Deloitte Access Economics to investigate how much could be saved by diverting non-violent offenders into treatment instead of prison.
Too many of our mob that haven't already got a record, these young fellas that are being caught by the cops, so they don't qualify to be diverted to either counselling around first offence or to any other form of diversion. So we need to seriously look at how we do it for Aboriginal Australians.
The report, released in Canberra today, shows it costs a whole lot less to have young offenders on programs that deal with the most common causes of breaking the law, drug and alcohol abuse.
By diverting Indigenous offenders into rehab rather than into the prison system, you could save about $111,000 per prisoner in a year for each offender who is diverted. And that comes from a variety of different savings, in particular differences in costs between the prison system and the rehab facility, but also because of other positive outcomes such as reduced reoffending rates that are associated with the rehab facility and better health outcomes.
Around $3 billion is spent annually on Australian prisons. At the same time, a number of drug and alcohol services to assist Indigenous people have been wound back or cut by governments around the country.
In South Australia alone, we've just had the only rehabilitation centre that allocated for the whole family closed down. And for the Aboriginal community, there's not that much assistance in there. So we'll be going to Port Pirie.
Aboriginal man Byron Wright works with remote communities in South Australia tackling drug and alcohol abuse.
This is just a quick little visit to introduce the community and the children to the football football club while doing drug and alcohol education.
Yeah, just showing them different lifestyle sort of and
opportunities.
Byron Wright overcame a drug addiction that landed him in and out of jail from his teens. At 38, he learnt to read and write and went on to complete tertiary education.
I think personally a rehabilitation centre for myself would have been a lot better than going to jail.
Indigenous leaders are using the report to show reducing the high rates of incarceration is not just a social justice issue, but an economic argument.
I've decided that this will be a lifetime commitment for me. This is just not fair.
Yes, we do have rapists and murderers in our society, and those people need to be cared for and kept away from society. I can't speak on their behalf, but I can speak on behalf of fellas who have had no guidance from, no good role models or guidance from around, and they're just making silly mistakes, but they're getting locked up for it, and the taxpayer pays this money.